Malls are bustling, flights are full, hotels are crawling with people, premium cars are seen stuck in traffic jams. At first glance, India's consumer is doing just fine. But is that really the case? Are there cracks in India's post-pandemic consumption rush? And the reason this matters is that private consumption is the largest component of our GDP. It accounts for nearly 60% of it. So when we say that India should grow by 6, 7, 8%, what and how you and I decide to spend is a big part of that story. But before we get there, where are we exactly in India's growth cycle? People often forget India's growth was already slowing well before the pandemic. Through 2017, 2018, 2019, so actually long before the pandemic hit in 2020. And that's probably because the economy was hit by a series of shocks. Demonetization, a few months later the rollout of GST, radar for the real estate sector. I mean, look, these are great reforms, but if you impose them rapidly, it tends to disrupt the economy. And then we had the IL&FS bankruptcy, where non-bank financial companies or shadow banks faced a crisis of confidence. All these shocks hit India one after the other, hammering the economy and particularly the informal sector. So here's a neat chart done by Knight Frank on residential sales in India's top 8 cities. And you can clearly see how these consecutive shocks had caused India's real estate sector to slump. So if you were among the poor or say lower middle class at that time, not only was your life turned upside down by demonetization, but within a few months your small informal business got hit by the government demanding that you be GST compliant. And just when you got adjusted to that, shadow banks that gave you loans for everything from business to electric appliances found themselves in a crisis of confidence. And just when that stabilized, the pandemic hit, which again hit the bottom of the pyramid the hardest. Now, 2021 and 2022 was all about recovery from the pandemic. So if you lock down the economy, it is bound to bounce back. And so, as goods demand returned and then services demand returned, the economy started spurting back. And so we saw really strong growth rates. It is only since the end of 2022 that the dust settled and we could get some idea of how the economy was shaping up post the pandemic. And this is what we are seeing in the consumption story. First, consumption has been gradually improving, but it is what we economists like to call K-shaped. Why K-shaped? Because two arms of K go in opposite directions. So on one hand, we are seeing better off households spending with a vengeance. As I said, you can see this around you. SUV sales are rising. People are buying houses, buying luxury cars, premium phones, expensive watches, malls, flights, they're all full. E-commerce websites have been upbeat about festive sales. But even then, it's interesting that evidently airlines are reporting lower demand for air travel this Diwali than previous year festive seasons. That said, the other side of the K, pointing towards the bottom, those who are poorer have been hit harder. Because we've not only had the pandemic, but we've also had back-to-back years of high inflation. Inflation spiked from around 4% in 2018, 2019 to 6.6% in 2020 when the pandemic led to severe disruptions in the supply chains. It somewhat eased to 5.1% in 2021, but then input costs started rising and inflation shot up to 6.7% in 2022. Almost as much as it was during the pandemic in 2020 when supply chains were disrupted, which means that 100 rupees in 2019 is effectively worth close to 80 rupees today. And mind you, inflation typically hits the poor the hardest. A 5% increase in the price of rice will hit you harder if you earn, say, 10,000 rupees a month as opposed to, let's say, 1 lakh rupees. So we keep seeing this dichotomy in the economy. Urban demand doing well, but rural demand sagging. SUV demand strong, but entry-level cars and two-wheeler sales are struggling. FMCG companies are having a tough time because they end up relying a lot on rural India for their sales. Consumer discretionary demand is in fact facing problems. What is discretionary demand? It's the kind of spending you do because because you just feel like it. It's not the stuff that you need, like food or say basic soap. It's things like TV, washing machine, jewelry. And this happens when you have a good perception about your disposable income, when you feel secure about your job, you generally want to do retail therapy. Now, the latest data seems to suggest that India's discretionary demand might be struggling. Here's the latest from the RBI's Consumer Confidence Survey. So the numbers you see on the chart is the percentage of respondents who have reported that they are raising their spending minus the percent of people who are saying that they're cutting back their spending. So a positive number means that more people are increasing their spending than cutting back. Now, for essential items, that's the black line, over 80% on a net basis are saying that they have increased their spending. In fact, that percentage is back to pre-pandemic levels. Now have a look at the red line. This is for non-essential, discretionary spending. You can clearly see how it started declining sharply much before the pandemic started. You can also see that it's still below pre-pandemic levels. And very importantly, it's still in negative territory, which means that there are still a higher proportion of people reducing their spending than increasing. We are also seeing this, by the way, in industrial production data. While infrastructure, construction, capital goods are doing well, consumer goods are struggling, particularly consumer durables. This brings me to the next theme about the Indian consumer. They're taking on a lot more loans. Households' net financial savings has fallen to 5.1% of GDP from a high of 11.5% of GDP during the pandemic and around 8% of GDP before that. Part of this is because financial liabilities of households have picked up. That is, people are taking on more and more loans. And look, on the face of it, that's not necessarily a bad thing. People are buying houses, the real estate sector is doing well, banks in recent times have been aggressively lending to the retail sector. So you could say that that's great, Auradeep. What are you so worried about? People's savings are going down, but their physical assets are picking up. Yes, that's true. But here's what's also happening. More and more people are now taking on personal loans. If you scroll down your phone messages, you'll probably have dozens of companies telling you that you are pre-approved of a loan of 75,000 rupees or say 1 lakh rupees, no documentation required. It could be the case that people are getting new credit cards or using their credit cards much more. These are all known as unsecured loans, loans against which banks and non-bank finance companies do not hold any collateral or security. So for them, it is high risk, and for you, the Indian consumer, it's high interest rates. RBI officials have said that unsecured loans in the past couple of years have grown by around 23%, while other categories have seen around 12 to 14% growth. So if you are borrowing not to buy assets, but for sustaining regular consumption, now that might be a problem. There are reports that people are defaulting more and more on smaller ticket size loans within the unsecured loan basket. Latest data from CIBIL shows that 51% of consumers who availed small ticket personal loans already had more than 4 loans at the time of availing that new loan. This compares to only 17% of the people that were in this situation back in June 2019. Now, it's worth mentioning that overall banking sector's non-performing assets are actually just fine. Banks and the RBI has in fact, they've done a stellar job in cleaning up balance sheets in the past few years. And you could argue that unsecured loans are after all a small part of the overall portfolio. So maybe this won't be an issue for banking sector stability for now. But it was quite interesting that RBI Governor Shaktikanta Das in the recent October policy meeting went out of his way to warn banks on their rising exposure to unsecured loans. And more importantly, it also raises questions on how strong India's consumption inherently is. So, what's next for India's consumption story? Well, there are some risks on the horizon. First, we've had a really bad spell of monsoons. So this is the main southwest monsoons that takes place between June to September. Monsoon started off late and it has been very uneven. Both across the month, even the spread across India has been uneven. So some parts got heavy rainfall while regions in the south and the east have faced a shortage. Both of these ends up destroying crops. So it's not surprising that Kharif sowing of pulses, of cotton, of oilseeds have turned out lower than last year. And whenever monsoons are bad or erratic, it tends to hit rural demand and agricultural output. So the rural recovery that markets and companies were hoping for this year, well, that might turn out to be trickier than anticipated. Second, inflation. Yes, headline inflation is moderating. It's back to 5% levels in the RBI's comfort zone of around 4 to 6%. Yes, core inflation, so non-food and non-fuel inflation. So this is household goods and services, personal care, clothing, etc. That inflation has been stable. Household inflation expectations have been stable. However, food inflation remains elevated. Even if you exclude the volatile vegetable prices like tomatoes or onions that tend to shoot up one month and fall the next, prices of rice, of wheat, of pulses, of milk, sugar, spices are very elevated. And remember, the bottom of the household pyramid ends up spending a bigger chunk of their budget on food. So higher food inflation tends to hit them the hardest, which is likely in turn to hit their demand for other spending. Third, the global economy isn't in a great shape. Higher interest rates to control inflation there has slowly started to impact Western economies. And you can see that effect filter through in the results of Indian IT companies, which are struggling and are talking of reducing headcounts. Some are even saying that they won't do campus recruitments this year. Can you imagine? If mass recruiters are not going to recruit the masses, then who will? And this means that various IT-linked urban centers in India, so places like Bangalore, Hyderabad, Pune, Gurgaon, might end up getting impacted too. And finally, the RBI has been raising interest rates for the past year or so from 4% to 6.5% to control inflation. And their commentary so far seems to suggest that they're looking to keep these interest rates higher for longer. So home loans, auto loans, those unsecured loans that are all the rage, all of those will attract higher interest rate burdens, making it a tougher environment to sustain consumption momentum. But look, I don't want to sound unnecessarily pessimistic. I mean, these are issues with India's consumption story, but that said, it's also a fact that we are a billion plus population that is heavily aspirational. We need that new Apple phone. We need those multiple holidays in the year, some even abroad. It's not a coincidence that the Ambanis have opened not just one but two luxury malls, one luxury and one, in fact, ultra luxury mall next to each other in Bandra Kurla complex in Mumbai. And we will continue purchasing essentials, taking flights, taking taxis, going to movies, buying electrical appliances, and so on. So the top of the pyramid will probably still continue making money and spending money. And they will make the consumption juggernaut roll forward. Just that the juggernaut might end up facing some potholes on that road. For more such insights, like, share, and subscribe to The Bond Economist.